At times, life can take us down strange paths, sometimes to places that we could never believe. Today's story is an excellent example of this, with desperation and curiosity leading the protagonist to something completely unexpected. As much as we fear the unknown, this story clearly shows that exploring these places is a vital part of living life to the fullest. With that being said, we hope that you enjoy the video. Our story begins in the depths of the Peruvian mountains. The team was freezing cold, looking at each other with fear as they wondered about what would come next. Nothing could have prepared them for this. For months, they had been putting together plans, routes, everything was supposed to be in place for a successful trip. But something terrible had gone wrong. James was more nervous than anyone else. In the beginning, his anxiety had not been nearly as great. The only thing that he was scared of was losing the respect of his friends. But now, things were far more serious. He had risked their lives, they were limited on supplies, and they were all running out of ideas. At first, everyone had kept their confidence, even with a few setbacks, losing equipment and being unable to track the map. Still, the team kept faith in their leader, but that was changing now. As James tried to keep control of everything, he could see the resentment in their eyes as he barked out orders. He was sure that the end was coming. It was just a matter of time now. The sky was no longer the brilliant blue that they had all envisaged on their way here. The higher they got into the mountains, the more perilous everything seemed to become. Little by little, the group became convinced that the elements were against them. There was nothing that could be done. By the end of the day, there was not one man in the team of 8 that was not exhausted. Some of them had next to no stamina left. How could they? All they had done for days was walk, carrying rucksacks that seemed to get heavier by the hour. In their minds, they had been fools to think that any of this had been possible. They should have done their research. Why had they ever put so much faith in him? As they all began to doubt the journey once again, James remained standing, waiting out in front and peering over into the great valley that lay below them. Although no one else could appreciate it, he saw great beauty in everything around him. But still, he knew that this was useless in terms of rallying his friends once again. They had lost so much confidence in him, and he knew that he would have to do the impossible in order to gain it back. Very softly, with his back to the rest of the team now, he could faintly hear their voices. Even though he couldn't make out the words, he was confident that they were discussing his failures, the mistakes that he had made to lead them all here. James barely knew how to feel anymore as he heard their soft but brittle words. As much as his mind wanted to explode with anger, he knew in his heart that he deserved all of this. They were suffering because of his mistakes. James cursed at himself, only now sensing the gravity of all that he had done. There was no escaping any of this. He had to find a way out of this mess, or he would die trying. It was that simple. His heart thumped as he thrust his head into his hands. His mind was screaming now, telling him not to cry, as his thoughts flooded with the hopes that he once had. The voices of everyone behind him had now fallen completely silent. For a dreadful moment, he believed that they were the ones now listening. Just then, a brown flicker drew him back from the emotions. It was the first piece of life that he had seen outside of the group. With this, his focus alighted once more. Not knowing what he was doing anymore, he felt determined to act, determined to find out what was lurking behind the bushes ahead. Even if it was nothing, still he had to be sure. Somehow, some way, there had to be a way out of this. James could feel his heart racing now as he sprinted forward, darting down the path and into the fog where he had seen the flicker from before. There had to be something here. He was sure that he had seen something. And there it was. Straight away, he couldn't help but feel a slight tinge of disappointment. Of course, more than anything else, he had hoped for another person. A local would have been fantastic, someone who could have told them where to go from here. Unfortunately, there was no such luck in this situation. It was just a dog. What good would that do? Almost all of James wanted to dismiss the animal as soon as possible. After all, there was nothing that the dog could do to help them. And yet, as soon as he said this to himself, he sensed that things wouldn't be so simple. Even though it seemed like a ridiculous thought, he was convinced that the dog was not in any way ordinary. "James, what are you doing out there?" The voice was sharp, ringing out down the path and up to James and the dog. Internally, James begged that his friend be quiet, absolutely positive that the dog would flee, startled by the sudden noise. And yet, there was next to no reaction. The dog couldn't care less about the noise that it had heard. The dog had now set the pace at a canter. As soon as James saw what his friend was referring to, he grounded to a halt. His body froze completely. It was unlike anything that he had ever seen before. The statue was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. None of it made sense. The snake structure was draped around the expanse of the tree. The team soon burst into frightened whispers. As much as they knew that the gargantuan snake wasn't real, there was something deeply off-putting about how accurate the statue was. How on earth had someone been able to craft something so realistic? The dog, quite unlike the rest of them, saw no reason to fear in the least. It was apparent straight away that this was one of the dog's favorite places. By now, the pace that the dog had set had come to an end, with their new companion circling the statue with a gleeful smile on its face. Even with the relief on the dog's face, there was still alarm amongst the rest of them. As awe-inspiring as the image of the snake statue was, it didn't help them at all in finding a way out of here. A murmur of worry now broke out across the clearing. If anything, things had just gone from bad to worse. To many of them, this was just another failure that James had collected during the expedition. Where were they going to go next? Just as the disorder broke out once again, there was a sound that none of them were expecting. They couldn't understand the language as it was shrieked out from the depths of the trees. It was scarcely human, and yet they knew that they had been followed. Things went from bad to worse as the dogs scurried off into the dark. The last bit of hope that they held onto had now abandoned them. There was nothing else now. This was surely the end. As much as the men knew that times could change fast in places like these, nothing could prepare them for the ambush that approached from all directions. As soon as they heard the sound of tremendous footsteps all around them, they knew that it was every man for himself. James was the only one that stood his ground, adamant that he would. There was a quiet stoicism to the animal, even though its mixed coat was shaggy and worn. There was a brightness and vigor in its eyes. If he hadn't seen it before, James was now sure that there was something greater to the dog, something hidden. Bizarrely, it was as though the dog understood what James saw now. It had become aware of his curiosity and took this as a sign to move on. The dog turned sharply, slowly making its way up higher and into the vast woodland that lay up ahead. Despite himself, James couldn't allow to feel the anxiety that had carried him this far. He was sure now that the dog knew what he wanted. As he said this to himself, he felt crazy, insane even. Unfortunately, this was his only option left now. "James, where are you going?" The voice of his team rang out once again behind him. Now, quite unlike before, they had become energized by his strange disappearance, flooding to his side as he pursued the dog silently. "James, you need to be quiet," James said shortly, pressing a hand to his lips before indicating toward the dog. As soon as he said this, the friends that collected around him seemed stunned into silence. Had their leader, the man that had led them into all of this, gone completely mad? Between themselves now, they exchanged puzzled glances, all of them coming to the same conclusion. Reading their minds, James grumbled, telling them that this was their only way out now. Not sure if this would keep their faith, James soon followed this up by saying that there were no other options. "James, if any of you have any better ideas, I suggest that you speak up now." The silence fell once again. Nobody dared challenge him. In spite of all of his failures over the last few days, it was as though in that moment he cast a memory over the rest of the team. The flare of confidence that he showed, it was reminiscent of his former self, the leader that he had been on all of their expeditions before. Now, James hoped with all of his soul that he could channel this once again. They needed him, and he was determined not to let them down once again. There was something almost meditative about their pursuit of the dog, something almost mesmerizing as it scampered so patiently ahead of them. At no point during their new journey did the animal dart its head back towards them. It was as though the dog knew of their plight and was completely aware of the responsibility that fell on its shoulders now. Even as the team had to develop confidence in the animal that led them on, few of them could help but feel wary. All around them, the environment was becoming darker and darker, the trees becoming thicker and taller with every step that they took. As they made their way past the entrance to the woods, they felt increasingly misled by everything that James had told them before. They were never even aware that there were woods in this area of the mountains. For some of them, this meant that their doubts mounted even more. They could rely on little more than prayers now. Then, there was a hint of movement. All of a sudden, the dog had decided to change direction. The men were as anxious as ever now, but didn't hesitate in following on. Little by little, the dog's pace had started to increase, leading some of the men to start jogging at a light pace. Even though the level of intensity wasn't that high, exerting themselves at this altitude was agony. Each of them, especially James, could feel their lungs burning as they climbed higher and higher, wishing once again that all of this could be over soon. They didn't know how much longer they could hold out without a break. "What's that?" It was Nathan's voice. Up until this point in the trip, he had been relatively silent. As skilled as he was, he had never felt the need to lead from the front. His words carried up to James, who was doing everything he could to keep up with. Now, protect those that he had failed. After everything that he had done, he felt that this was the least that he could do, especially after leading his team astray once again. Unarmed, he scrambled his way to some sort of cover. Meanwhile, the rest of the team had tried to find safety in another part of the clearing, bolting off into all directions. He could feel his heart hammering against his chest, now sure that their luck had to run out soon. In his streak of fear, he had actually been unaware of what he was shielded by. It was none other than the great snake statue towering over his squatted frame. As he listened out for danger dreadfully, everything around him had gone silent. Now, this was 10 times worse than the terror that had come over him as he heard the ambush for the first time. His mind racing like never before, his thoughts soon switched to the rest of the team. Had they been as lucky as him, or were they being picked off one by one? At the moment, just the idea of it made him want to be sick. It was the crunch of the ground that made James snap back to reality, once again feeling the intensity that he had been flung into only moments before. He could hear the footsteps now, just a little further to his right heart, now firing at a frenetic rate. James finally dared to peek his head out into the madness, feeling the adrenaline buzz through his body. Sure enough, a masked man lay ahead, snapping his head from side to side as he tried to uncover the men that had stumbled into his territory. James's racing heart fell as he saw Daniel, another member of the team, cowering only mere meters away from where the man was standing. He was sure that his friend would be uncovered soon. From there, it would only make sense that he would be found as well. He had to act before it was too late. Just as he was about to do the unthinkable, everyone heard a distinct bark cut through the silence once again. The effect was instant. Now the dog had surely saved them from certain peril. The masked man turned around in an instant, chasing the dog that now appeared across the path. Soon after, James held his breath as he watched at least another dozen of the masked men, all dressed in rags, chased after their newly found companion. After the sacrifice that the creature had apparently made, he felt a strong will to call out to save the thing that had saved them. Just as he felt this, however, he knew that he had a duty to the rest of the team. This was their chance to at least make it to tomorrow. He could not afford to let it be wasted. It was only when they were all certain that the men finally decided to reappear, as breathless as ever, as they tried to come to terms with what had just happened. There was no way that they had really experienced that. The looks that they exchanged now were no longer those of fear or anger. They were simply lost in their exasperation. For the first time on all of their travels, they had experienced something that truly left them speechless. They had evaded the attack. The group remained silent as they sought to find a way out from the woodland. As they progressed further and further toward the mouth of the woods, there were still a few members of the team that would dart a glance back to see the snake statue that they left behind, somehow still eager to investigate it as much as it still terrified them to their very core. They could not help the sense that it harbored some dark secrets. There was something there that they simply had to know, and yet they could not quite articulate it. Alex, who could still feel himself shaking slightly from the whole ordeal that they had just experienced, now felt entranced once again by the snake statue that stood all that way back. Every time he looked back at its form, he felt himself shudder with the grotesque grin that seemed to fight through its face. Just the thought of it made his skin crawl. Why would someone ever even think of making something like that? To him, it was clearer than ever that the men who had tried to attack them were some kind of devil worshippers. Surely it was them that had designed and built the snake statue. It was the only explanation that seemed to make sense. As much as Alex couldn't get over what he had experienced, he remained committed to his silence, sure to only discuss it once they had gotten home safely. The group's thoughts were ignited once again as they heard the bark that had saved them only minutes before. It was a miracle. As though nothing had happened at all, the dog's face was still alight with a joyful smile. For the first time in what felt like forever, the group was now set alight by a glimmer of happiness. In spite of everything that had happened to them over the last few days, and especially just now, they had not lost their appreciation for things of beauty in the world. James was the first to run toward the dog, embracing it. As he lifted his canine friend, the dog barked delightedly again as the group gathered around. As much as James knew that there was far more to be done if they were to get out of this for good, this didn't seem to be affecting the rest of the team nearly as much. Now there was a new wave of energy that coursed through them as they had been reunited with their savior. Before long, however, of course, they had to return their thoughts to action. How exactly did they plan to proceed from here? As though the dog had read their thoughts once again, their new friend began to lead the way once again, tail wagging as it did so. Also, seemingly for the first time since the entire journey had begun, the entirety of the team was now bubbling with conversations, still barely able to believe what they had just experienced, and of course, how they had been able to even survive it. Everything that had happened seemed to go beyond all thoughts and imagination. Even though each of them regretted the struggle that they had had to endure in order to get to this point, not one of them could help the feeling that they had stumbled across something magnificent. In many ways, they now felt that the journey had been the price to pay for what they had experienced just now. One thing was for certain. They would return in order to uncover all of the secrets that lay here. The valleys below had now opened up before them in tremendous fashion. It was truly breathtaking. The mist and clouds that had once cloaked much of the environment now cleared entirely. All of the men were now able to admire the great landscape that sprawled in front of them. It was truly incredible. The explosive blue sky twinned with the brilliant emerald of the trees. At long last, each of the team were able to experience what they had envisaged from the start. It was a realization of the dream that they had had all along. At last it was their reality. With this, the descent back to where they came was far more pleasant than the incline. Members of the team would often take turns petting the dog that had done so much to save them. Even as they did so, many of them were unsure of how they would be able to thank the animal that had ultimately saved their lives. What was it that a dog could desire over all else in the world? Each of them felt supported by boundless optimism as the last of the mist had now cleared completely. Before long, the village from which they had started their journey was now in clear sight. Although they were sure that there would be at least another hour of hiking to do before they got there, the relief that swept over them was still unlike anything else that they had experienced. Not one of them could explain how the dog had managed to navigate them so effectively. In the end, they could only guess that the animal had found itself here many years ago, perhaps without its family. It had been forced to fend for itself. Even as they felt this somber thought, it could not bring down their elation. They were back. Nothing could stop them now. No one believed the men as they tried to tell others what they had seen. At base camp, they met many other hikers who were eager to hear their story, but soon became disengaged as they listened more. Everyone else thought that they were liars. That high up, there was no civilization, nobody, and yet they couldn't understand what the dog was doing up there. Despite the words of everyone else, the team was certain in what they had witnessed. As James turned around to face the landscape that he had just returned from, he was sure that he would have to go back, even if it meant encountering the ambush again. There had to be something that he could do to document what he had seen. Years later, the dog that had accompanied the team on their journey had now joined them. James had thought long and hard about the name that he could give to his new friend, but nothing quite seemed to fit. It seemed like he could never get the harsh landscapes out of his head, all that he had seen and experienced during his time up in the Peruvian mountains. At long last, he came to a solution: Rocky. The dog was as loving and loyal as any person that he had met. Before long, Rocky had become his companion in everyday life, soon becoming a key part of his family. Now that all of those years had gone by, James could finally sit back and appreciate all that had happened. One day he would take a seat in his room, looking ahead at all of the artifacts that he had collected over the years. There was a moment where a tear nearly came to his eye. Before long, Rocky had bounded up into his chair and jumped on his lap. It was as though the dog already knew what came next. They were going to reminisce about the journey that had brought them together. Sure enough, at the center of everything, between all of the maps and images of expeditions being and gone, there was something that the two of them would always remember to this day. It was the fabric that bound the team together. A team of explorers uncover a lost relic in the Peruvian mountains, uncovering the truth about the stone snake that archaeologists believed to be a myth. It was a famous international newspaper. This edition had come out only days after the team had traveled back up the mountains, of course with Rocky's help, in order to rediscover the strange artifact that they had stumbled across before. The newspaper bore a photo of the entire team with Rocky front and center with his old happy smile. Below, one could see the characteristic deathly look of the crafted snake. Even now, James thought that he could see evil in its eyes. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider sharing it with someone who may find it interesting. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.